Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, guests, my name is Miloš Reznik. I'm director of the German Historical Institute at Warsaw, and I consider it a great honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting as part of the Lelewel Talks series, held regularly twice per year and named after a prominent representative of Polish historiography and political thought in the first half of the 19th century. In these discussions, we address current, sometimes controversial issues in contemporary historical science, but today we would like to use it to discuss the results and perspectives of our project on the relationship between knowledge, migration, and the political circumstances of the Cold War. Under the title Relations in the Ideoscape, Middle Eastern students in the Eastern Bloc, a team of researchers for 3 years in a joint project of the Max Weber Foundation's institutes studied students from the Middle East and North Africa in the Soviet bloc between the 1950s and 1980s, especially in Poland, the Soviet Union, and the German Democratic Republic. The 3 participating institutes of the Max Weber Foundation were Oriental Institute in Beirut, the German Historical, our institute, German Historical Institute at Warsaw, and the German Historical Institute in Moscow. We have 2 staff members from our Warsaw Institute among us in this moment, Dorota Woroniecka-Krzyżanowska, who will moderate the discussion, and Mustafa Switat, welcome. But I would also like to mention the main project coordinators, Professor Birgit Schäbler, director of the Beirut Institute, and Ala Al-Hamadna. The project shall end in some 3 months, but its main outputs can be expected in the coming period, including an exhibition under the title Common Spaces, building migrations in the context of Cold War, which we will open in mid-February at the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. I would like to thank Kinga Wołoszynko-Wanda for the energy and work she put into preparing the exhibition. You are warmly invited to visit the exhibit in February or March, but for now, I'm giving the floor to the main players in today's meeting. They are to be introduced just now, and I wish you all a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reznik. My name is Dorota Woroniecka-Krzyżanowska, and I would like to join Professor Reznik in welcoming you all to today's 21st Joachim-Lelewel talk. And before introducing the distinguished discussants that we'll have the pleasure of listening to today, let me first briefly comment on the theme of today's panel discussions, that is knowledge relation and the Cold War. So when we think about the Cold War, the first things that often come to mind are arms race and the resultant military conflicts, the clash between different models of social, political, and economic systems, but also competition in the fields of knowledge and technology. And of course, probably the space race is the most prominent showcase of this competition. But also in the wake of decolonization, both sides of the political divide strove to bring countries of the then called Third World into their spheres of influence. So in the wake of decolonization, both sides of the political divide strove to bring countries of the then called Third World into their spheres of influence. And these efforts were, of course, multidimensional, but included various kinds of educational and development programs that aim to bring very particular knowledge and expertise to countries of the post-colonial world and put them on the path of capitalist or socialist modernization. part of the Eastern Bloc, Polish People's Republic also actively participated in these efforts, sending its experts abroad, but also offering scholarship opportunities to third world students. So the goal of today's low-level talk is to have a closer look at the actors involved in the knowledge relations between the Polish People's Republic and the countries of Africa and the Middle East. And unlike the rather prevalent discourse of knowledge transfer, whereby the knowledge and technical expertise from the first or second world was to be taught or implemented in the third, the perspective of knowledge relations shifts focus on how knowledge was produced in interaction between different actors, students, teachers, experts, institutions, in very particular spatial and temporal contexts that are necessary to understand the process. To do that, today's debate brings together scholars working on both third world students in Poland and Polish experts abroad, what already shows that the ideas traveled both ways. Their research findings and experiences, I think, pose interesting questions on the complex trajectories, mechanisms, and perhaps afterlives of the knowledge mobilities during the Cold War. So let me move to introducing the participants. We have today with us Dr. Justyna Turkowska, who studied history, sociology, and political science at the Universities of Warsaw, Berlin, and Hanover. Her PhD thesis on the transnational aspects of the history of medicine in the eastern borderlands of the German Empire was awarded the Fritz Theodor Epstein Award of the Association of German Historians of Eastern Europe, among others. Dr. Turkowska currently works as that lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and her current research project analyzes the transfer and circulation of technical and geological expertise, as well as the role of experts and their activities within the global North-East-South solidarity ties and cooperation patterns in the 1960s to 1980s. She is also currently a visiting fellow here at the German Historical Institute of Warsaw. Our second discussant today, Dr. Matthieu Gillabert, is a senior lecturer in contemporary history at the University of Fribourg. As a specialist in the history of Swiss cultural diplomacy, his research focuses on the trans-bloc cultural relations. He has also published an illustrated monograph on the history of Warsaw. And since 2014, he developed several projects on student mobilities and student movements in the Cold War, especially in the Eastern Bloc and with a post-colonial approach. And in 2021, he defends his habilitation on the subject from the internationalization of the university to student internationalism, student migration in Europe at the time of university massification. Finally, Dr. Zaur Gasimov, who studied international relations, international law and history in Baku and Berlin, and who in 2009 graduated from the PhD program at the Catholic University Eichstätt-Ingolstadt and joined the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz. From 2013 to 2019, Dr. Gasimov was a senior research fellow at the German Orient Institute in Istanbul. And in 2020, he joined the Russian Studies Department of the University of Bonn as a DFK principal investigator. His last monograph, a historical dictionary of Azerbaijan, new edition, was published in 2018. Thank you all for being with us today. And I would like to start with asking the panelists or the discussants of today's talk to give us a little background into your research projects and how they relate to the theme of today's talk. If I can ask Dr. Turkowska to start.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a nice introduction and for the invitation to the low-level talk. Well, as today we're going to talk about the logic and trajectories of knowledge relation between the global north and global south. So my contribution is going to be represented as for today, particularly by the Polish case and Polish geological geographical engagement in West Africa, namely Ghana, Nigeria, and Guinea. And to jump right away into the topic of, and the question how ideas were produced and how ideas traveled, I would like to give you perhaps a short framing. One might ask how geography and geology might contribute to the circulation of ideas, especially if we consider that this knowledge is kind of invisible at first glance, right? But if you think about it, cartology and geology in particular became in the wake of the Cold War, keeping with the colonial tradition, an important element of now post-colonial globality and imagined spatial positioning in relation to each other, both understood in terms of meeting up through practices and relations of a multitude of trajectories. After all, as the newly independent countries of the global south, in the 50s or in the process of the decolonialization emphasis, a true political and economical independence could be based only on economic and societal modernization and development, whatever these terms were to be defined, and both required suitable cartographic materials. So thus, it's hardly surprising that this period in particular witnessed a great increase of geological experts to the global south. The recruitment of experts from abroad was urgently needed there due to the lack of indigenous experts as a result of withdrawal of the previous colonial power structure and infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure, and also due to the general shortage of systematically elaborated materials and geological methods. The lack of staff has grown as in Ghanaian case in the 50s from collected practically from scratch. So to close the gap, the Ghanaian Geological Survey, to stay by the Ghanaian example for a minute, went in the early 60s of a recruitment mission to Europe, among other policies, to recruit individual geologists. Simultaneously, it benefited from the diverse technical aid programs that the Ghanaian state signed up with Canada, America, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Poland, among others, or to name just a few, and from the geological survey teams that went to Ghana within this framework. Therefore, the initial situation was conceived very asymmetrical, as we could argue, very asymmetrical from the start, with the foreign experts as mentors and the local experts as apprentices who, as it was hoped, would acquire the modern expertise within the next few years. However, not the global north, but rather Ghana, so the global south, did dictate or at least co-decided what and whose knowledge is wanted, in which field, and where the experts are recruited. Furthermore, the local encounters often scratch a different picture of the originally assumed asymmetry and place the foreign and the local expertise in direct competition with each other, revealing the limits of the knowledge universalization. So controversies and different approaches to what knowledge should be applied, how it should be applied, what is modern, and how portable knowledge can be made locally applicable were not rare despite it blanking in public. So sometimes the complaints refer to some conflicts between the foreign and local workers, sometimes to the lack of willingness to cooperate. That could be view of both sides, sometimes to the drilling or exploring methods they were considered by the one or the other side as less appropriate. The Ghanaian staff was not always familiar with the knowledge to be adapted, the foreign experts with the local conditions to be taken into account. The latter often created situation in which the experts dispatched as mentors would first have to learn from the local colleagues to be able to apply and pass on the knowledge at all. The translation was further complicated by the multiplication of knowledge-generating bodies and the person-related hierarchization of experts. And again, the hierarchy did not simply follow the logic of the Cold War. Both the Western, the same as the Eastern European countries, were often questioned in their expertise and exploration methods by the African partners. So the conflicts and friction follow less the north-south or west-east dichotomy, but rather complex personal and material networks that emerge via the cooperation on the ground through and in cooperation with local networks and international professional communities. And just, if I might, to briefly refer to another important aspect of knowledge mobilities, this cooperation was shaped by at least two actors or two factors, the already mentioned human one and the non-human, namely by the material objects. Right? After all, every project required specific instruments and material-based knowledge. It further reproduced it. And above all, these materials objects were used for and resulting from such projects constituted the key feature in advance of the technical cooperation, and also created a complex network of personal relations that in turn were used to facilitate the globalized connections. So moving instruments, samples, materials like maps, schemes, reports, back and forth between experts group and laboratories located in Ghana, as well as outside of Ghana. In the Polish case, it would be Krakow or Kielce or Warsaw, created a multiplication of center of calculation, initially designed to be built up in Ghana by the foreign experts. It created further multiplication of center of knowledge production and repeatedly updated the new alliances and the global imposition to each other. So the geological instance materiality had great significance similar to the mapping scale or the moments of waiting to deliver the geological equipment shipped to West Africa from Poland or Soviet Union and been stuck in the port for several months. Viewed in this way, everybody, the samples, the maps, the geologists, the ministers, and the local workers were equal parts of the globalizing and decisive action of power and competence over the knowledge relation and coding of spatial relation. So as for now, I would just mention this, let's say, these two main aspects, the human and non-human, that were key for the mobilities and the way how ideas were negotiated.
Thank you so much. If I can ask Matthieu to comment on, to introduce his research perspective and his research findings.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation. My work on the relation in the academic field between Poland and Third World is still in progress. But to show you what is my perspective to this topic, I would like to give some information of my background. As you have said, my doctoral thesis was on Swiss cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. And then I conducted several research projects on student mobility, particularly in France at the time of decolonization. And in the third phase, I'm interested now in this student mobility during the Cold War on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in particular in Poland. And with these three aspects, I would like to show in my research the importance to put on cultural diplomacy, but not only in institutional level, but to show that cultural diplomacy is linked with a lot of actors, a lot of networks, and also with student international organizations. And in the context of knowledge exchange in Poland, I'm interested especially on the three levels. First, I think that history of science diplomacy in Poland, but also in the other communist countries, is to be written. And as I have said, it's not only in the institutional way, but to show this diplomacy as a complex system between diplomats, between academic actors, with also students and experts. And to understand where Poland is active in the south, in the global south, I think we have to take together all this level of actors, and not only the diplomatic one, not only the academic one, but it's a mix between all these actors. And one of the actors I'm interested, as I have said, is the student. And in my research on the student world or student environment, I got the impression, and I've seen that students have a great capacity to organize themselves and to show a kind of agentivity through international organization, like, for example, International Union of Students, through international meeting, such like international festivals. We can see that the students themselves organize their mobility, but also knowledge exchange between each other. We see this, for example, in the activity of this organization, where students, for example, make some committees to have better conditions for life in Poland, and such committees and organizations is only possible with international connections between students. There are some international organizations, as I have mentioned. There are also national organizations of students themselves, where we can observe such knowledge exchange. There is, for example, the Song Festival in Poznan, Festival Solidarności, and then that was the Festival Piosenki I Tańca Studentów Cudzoziemców. And we see here that students organize, also with the help of academic staff, but it's an initiative of students to create space for knowledge exchange. And we can see also this at a more local level, like student hostel, student club, and I've focused my research now on the studium in Łódź, where, as you know, almost all students had to begin their Polish life with the learning of Polish language. And finally, there is this diplomatic, science diplomatic level with this complexity. The second level of my interest is the student level, and the third level of my interest is to see the different contact of the students with the urban environment. What kind of contacts, what role do foreign students play in cultural life, in political life, or in everyday life? And I see this student presence as a very important vector of a typical communist bloc globalization in the second half of the 20th century. And for this level, I analyze, but I can come back to this point, but analyze media that are that produce some representation of this foreign presence in the Polish cities. By the way, because I am also a specialist of history of Francophonie, I put a small focus to see if the presence of these foreign students is a way for Poland to continue traditional Francophilie. As you know, there is an important Francophilie 19th century in Poland, and we can see that there are some new contacts between Poland and French-speaking countries in the global south after the decolonization, for example, with Senegal or with Mali. And I think it's an interesting point to see that there is a old Francophilie in Poland that can be continued in a certain way with these contacts with the global south. So I fully agree with the idea that there is no one-way transfer of knowledge. There is no not only grant for foreign students to come to Poland to study. There is no one-way transfer with the export of expertise, but whether there is a form of circulation, attracting students with scholarships, but there are also students who came at their own expense without scholarship, but this incoming of students contributed to sharing representations of the PRR. It was ways of life and specific knowledge, but also this foreign presence in Polish cities, racialized presence marked by Poland's geostrategic situation in the communist bloc also brings new representation within the Polish society. So there is, for me, a form of circulation rather than transfer of knowledge. And maybe for the moment I will stop and I can come again back to some points. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Now I'll give the voice over to Zaur. I decided that because we are in the English-speaking format, so I will just use the names. I allow myself that. Okay, over to you, Zaur. Your take on the topic based on your research experiences and findings, please.
First of all, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I will maybe start with how I came to the interest on, or how the interest emerged on transfer of knowledge and of knowledge production, or shared knowledge production, or shared production of knowledge. Maybe the main source was my habilitation project that was devoted to Promethean movement, a sort of anti-Soviet strategy of Poland in the interwar period, and Polish backing of non-Russian immigrants across Europe, and the emergence of Polish Oriental studies at that time in the contact with the Tatar and Central Asian and other representatives, residents of Warsaw and beyond. In my current project, so one project within of Ideoscapes is devoted to Iranian to Iranologists or Iranian specialists on Persian studies who were based in Poland, but their way to Poland was via Łódź. But in Łódź, it was very interesting what Matthieu told. It was not only to study Polish, but to study filmmaking. So because of Szkoła Filmowa over there, and in the main project I'm working on within of my DFG position is on the role of Polish and Hungarian and Soviet specialists in the Republic of Turkey from the 1920s until the 50s, and it's about knowledge transfer and contribution to the circulation of special knowledge, particularly of humanities and language reform and museum building and stuff like that. What I would maybe stress at that point, particularly what Justyna told and also Matthieu told with Francophilie and Francophonie, that it's very tricky to look how the knowledge production and transfer of knowledge is connected, but should not obligatory be connected to the ethnicity, that the notions like Frenchness or in that case Sovietness, Russianness, whatever, are much more up to the linguistic competences or to the competences related to the acquired knowledge and not primarily to the ethnicity. One of the examples maybe would be that the specialists on Roman languages, particularly in French, from the Soviet Baku, were as a rule sent after the graduation of the university to Mali or to other French-speaking countries in Africa, and not directly to Brussels or to Paris. And there was a very interesting transfer, reciprocal interaction between the non-Russian periphery within of the Soviet Union and the broad world of the Francophonie, in that case represented by the so-called Third World at that time. And that was the aspect with this, but in the same time also Europe is, it's so hard to exclude Europe from this relationship between Middle East and socialist bloc, because many immigrants it was started at the turn of the century. The Christian Arabs who came to Russia as the stipend holder to study theology, mostly Arab Orthodox, they taught French at the University of Kazan, but also in Moscow. So they suddenly, but they turn out as the French speakers in the Russian context, even without no experience of life and studies in France itself at that time. So it is a much more hybrid, and maybe the hybridity is that what makes the whole stuff so interesting and fascinating.
Yes, thank you very much for this first round of commentaries. I think you've raised a lot of interesting topics already. First of all, I really agree that perhaps, of course, knowledge transfer is probably not the term, but neither is knowledge exchange, as Justyna already mentioned, because it was actually pretty much always based on rather asymmetrical relations, at least at the start, or as an idea. Then, of course, it could have been transformed in the process, but it has been asymmetrical. So knowledge circulation is probably the best one to go. I also really like the idea that you said, like we all alluded to that this knowledge relations can't either be it the geologists in Ghana or students in third world students in Poland, or the worst case is that this knowledge relations also cannot really be reduced to this Cold War competitions, but there are so many other factors at play, such as religion, ethnicity, but also, as Justyna mentioned, human, non-human factors. I think this is also a very interesting point. That brings us to this idea that really of knowledge being produced in interaction and in particular spaces and at particular times. So I think also Matthieu very interestingly summarized it, like saying or talking about this many platforms on which this knowledge in which or this knowledge relations were built. So not only at the universities, but also, for example, in particular networks or events or at the street even, or in media. So I think it's first of all worth to look at the actors involved, but also at the spaces in which, or platforms in which this relations actually took place, and how the very context of the spaces impacted their character. So I wonder if you may want to react on that or on each other's comments.
I would dare to jump in then. That is a very interesting aspect you've touched now, the space also, and the structure of the space. We know actually, I mean, even if the Cold War period is like ended 30 years ago or something like that, and one could conduct also a lot of oral history projects on that, but still we don't know a lot on this very particular space, academic space or whatever space at the universities at that time. And that would be a very interesting challenge to get more knowledge on that, how they those students or those academicians who stayed in the countries of the socialist bloc, how they communicated, with whom they communicate, how intensive was this communication, was it person? I mean, we know about all the marriages and divorces, about the personal aspects, but we know less about the evolution of their worldview at that time, because majority didn't wrote memories or something like that, or didn't share memories. Maybe also due to the very specific nature of the Cold War Eastern Europe, maybe, I mean, because of security reasons or stuff like that. It was a case with the Iranian immigrants, that they were really afraid of writing down something or communicating on that. And but the aspect of the space is of huge importance. Also, their relationship with the Western world at that time, so during the Cold War, and with the countries of their origin, because it's very hardly to imagine that all the relations were cut. And now we know that it was not the case. So somehow they have managed in that world, in a pre-WhatsApp and pre-Skype world, that they managed still to maintain the contact. But I would add to this aspect, I mean, space is something what they have co-shaped. If we look at the space at that at the socialist Europe of that time during the Cold War, but they arrived with their own experience, and I would maybe delineate it with a Russian knowledge of bagage, luggage or baggage. In Russian, it has a second connotation of something what you bear with yourself, what you can bring with yourself, and that is something what cannot stay the same, cannot remain the same. That is always in change, in modification and in evolution, but it's still something what you bring with yourself. And in case of many East Europeans who may travel to United States or to other places of the world, the very definite culture of chess, the special feeling towards maybe ballet or stuff like that, or even perception of some aspects in literature and so on. that would be the case with this bagage. And it would be very interesting to look with what kind of luggage they arrived at that time, with what kind of own perceptions on sexuality, on cuisine, on nature perception and stuff like that, and how that changed through the decades they stayed in Eastern Europe. So.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point because there is the knowledge, I think is important in our discussion, but it's the experience that produce the knowledge, and such experiences are very very interesting, but also difficult to analyze because we have to go, we have to make a history from below and to go very close to these students. And but I think also it's very interesting, and I wanted also to highlight the word of Zaur, hybridity. I think it's very important because such experiences make the identity more complex, and the students have a very complex identity as other people, but with this experience, this identity is changed. But I think this hybridity is also to see, also could be seen also in the trajectories of students. They are often not from a point E to a point B, but when we see closer to the trajectories of students, they are very complicated. And the hazard is a very big thing. And I think above all for Poland, because for a lot of students, Poland was not a first choice to study. It was a second, third choice or an opportunity, but it was not a dream from rarely a dream from the childhood to go to Poland. So this Polish way is quite specific in comparison with, for example, France or maybe USSR, Moscow, and Poland. In this way, I think it's quite interesting point of view to analyze, because there is a hazard, and this experience is made also a bit with a hazard.
Okay, if I just might jump in and take up some of the points by of knowledge, I would always stick to perhaps this term negotiation of knowledge, because all of the three cases, and especially if we look at the daily practices of how the students or how the experts dealt with each other, how they interacted, then this observation, it's kind of very striking, which for the experts or for historical actors was kind of new. However, what the history of knowledge argue for a very long time, right? That knowledge is always a mutual negotiation, that it does not consist only of the epistemic references or academic knowledge, but of many different elements, and is produced not only in this epistemic framework, but also outside of the classroom, outside of the laboratory. And this is something, Zaur, as you mentioned, that it's not really visible in the public debate at that time, or even now it's quite difficult to find it in the archival sources. It is, however, or it's mentioned in the testimonies, like in my case, in some of the testimonies of the geologists or geographers, and only there, they mentioned this negotiation of knowledge between them and the local actors that, again, from the beginning on was actually conceived as a very asymmetrical situation or put in the asymmetrical framework, right? So what can be found in the public debate is more this exchange of knowledge or the negotiation of knowledge between, so to speak, the first and the second world, like the experts going to Ghana or Nigeria, meeting some British or Western European experts and being interested in the cultural and the knowledge exchange. However, the other aspect that were key for the projects being successful, so the cooperation and learning from the local partners, is not mentioned. The same if we look in the images from the, in my case, geological field, they are mostly the white or Western European, Eastern European actors, and the sub-Saharan African actors are not as represented, or if then in a more superior way as kind of supporting workers and not equal representatives. However, as I mentioned, especially at the beginning, the experts learned from both. They learned from the Western countries, the newest technologies, and from the local experts, how to translate their expertise into practical one, and how to adjust to environmental conditions, like, for example, volcanic activities they've never worked with or were never challenged by. And the first one, which is quite interesting, although the rhetoric was about we should be self-sufficient within the socialistic world. However, at the beginning, there were a lot of exchange at actually the whole time, right, with the Western world or the First War. And as even the Polish Minister Council argued still in the 60s, in the middle of the 60s, as long as the socialistic countries are not self-sufficient in terms of geological technologies and approaches and instruments, we are forced to be Western oriented. So the Polish geologists were sent to France, to Great Britain for some further training, or invited some experts from those countries. The local knowledge, again, the second step, the cooperation with the local African experts, was key, however, for the projects, and was not limited only to geological knowledge, but again contains as part of the, or address also knowledge like societal expertise about, for example, land claims, ownership over water sources or its usage, right? A knowledge that it's produced outside of the classroom or some ministry, but it's key. What leads me to what Zaur, you mentioned, how the spaces were created, what spaces were created. And again, they can be found in this testimony to some point, and showing us how the asymmetry was broken down in some particular aspects of asymmetry, or if it was not broken down, it was reversed to some degree. And perhaps some further aspects when you mention ethnicity and how knowledge is linked to the ethnicity and hybridity, what I'm kind of curious about, and this is going to be part of my project, but I haven't analyzed it as so far, is what kind of knowledge and what kind of new sensibilities the experts brought back home. And as we all know, in case of experts, once they return home, the African expertise was not as asked politically. They were kind of made invisible in the political sphere, right? They needed to, or they were kind of asked to report their experiences to the, for example, the Geological Survey Department, but nobody asked of, so really, and there were no consequences if they did not report it. And also, if you look in the geological or geographical journal, publications are not really easy to find, and they were very rare. However, what they did bring back were, for example, artifacts and also some experiences. And the question, or my question would be, if we think about the mutual negotiation of knowledge and how it was asymmetrical, at least on this institutional level, not necessarily on the epistemic level, and how this asymmetry was reversed, as I mentioned. how does breaking down the asymmetries and experiences that, at least rhetorically, were framed in the whole discourse of solidarity, how they did not only break down, but actually strengthen the notion of whiteness of the experts or the Eastern European students going abroad. And yeah, what were the kind of legacies, the racial legacies of this negotiation of knowledge? Yeah, thank you.
Let me just react to what you all said. I think I really like the idea of this bagage or luggage and the hybridity, because I think when you actually look at this trajectories or biographies of the students, they really cross boundaries and borders. And I remember one of my favorite cases being an Iraqi architect who did his BA in Japan, master's in the US, and PhD in Szczecin in Poland. So actually crossing all the borders that were there conceptually also. So I think that the trajectories and the impact of these trajectories on the actual knowledge relation and knowledge production is very interesting, but not only for students, but also for the experts. I myself work on Iraq and on Polish architects and academics who worked on Iraq. But more from the Iraqi side to understand how they were perceived by the Iraqis themselves. And when you look at the University of Baghdad in 1960, so the Department of Architecture, you had Polish staff or Czechoslovakian staff, but you had also American staff, you had also German staff. So there was actually a place where there were the impact, like the space where you had the kind of mixture of different influences, and when also the Polish experts actually not only had to learn the local context or had to kind of adjust to the local context or translate the local context, their knowledge or expertise adapted a little bit to the local context to be able to work simply, but also they learned from their kind of Western colleagues. So it was really a space of different kind of exchanges. But also this brings me to what Justyna, you mentioned about this hierarchies of knowledge and how they kind of worked in practice and were negotiated in this particular interactions between the experts, the Eastern European expert or Polish expert in our case, and their colleagues in Ghana, for example. And I was wondering how, if you could tell us a little bit more how it worked in practice. I found it a very interesting aspect of what you said. Because I remember that, for example, in the Iraqi case, it was very clear that that I think Matthieu mentioned that Poland was not the first choice to study. And the same was the case for the experts. Poles were often not the first, best choice, but they were best value for money. And when the department could not afford a Western expert, for example, they would go for Eastern Europeans as the second best choice. So all this kind of also financial factors played a role. So I was wondering how it was in your case.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. This is, of course, a kind of valid question. Who and why did go to Ghana and Nigeria? And as you mentioned, the Eastern European experts were perhaps not always the first choice. However, so there were several reasons why they became a target for the recruiting missions from Ghana and from Nigeria in the 60s and in the 70s. So a lot of them went already in the 50s or before signing up the bilateral agreement between Ghana and Poland and Nigeria and Poland. So already in the 50s, the whole exchange or technical assistance program started in the preliminary basis, and in the 60s, a lot of Polish geologists went to Ghana, and especially in the 70s too. Nigeria. And of course, from the side of the African state, they were interested, well, in Eastern European experts because they were cheaper, but also because they promise to reshaping of the global position and kind of reshaping of the post-colonial imperial position, right? So we have on the one side, especially if we look at Ghana, in the socialistic period of Ghana, this attempt to detach from the capitalist countries or from the British countries. However, Ghana still remains very strong and speaks out of the imperial position inherited from the British colonial system. So this is kind of a double play. And one of the reasons why they were interested in the Polish geologies. The same with Nigeria in the 70s, especially after the Biafra War, where, right, well, also like Soviet Union was, for example, not welcome in Nigeria. However, some other Eastern European countries were perceived as more reliable. In addition, we could say that also the contracts with the Eastern European experts, they offer different financial terms of cooperation than with the Western one. And the further factor, but also kind of important, was that the Eastern European experts were considered to inhabit the same world as West Africans, so the world of kind of semi-periphery or periphery, and were considered as a kind of new global player, new global player or new actors to kind of make a debut of the international stage. And again, a harbinger of a development model that promises a stronger political and economical independence, or at least a more equal conditions of the politic of spatial and epistemic connectivity. So such perception triggered the old colonial powers lost of their central position and ushered a reshaping of hierarchies of knowledge system. They were now decentralized as a kind of new actors were added. You mentioned how or you asked me about, how it looked in practice, the cooperation. So well, in the practice, the experts were invited as mentors, as a kind of unquestioned mentors. However, depending, for example, in Ghana, the Ghanaian side made an internal hierarchy of experts, not according to ability, but rather to ethnicity, or even not ethnicity, but nationality and political interest. So for example, the Bulgarian experts were treated better than the Poles. The Poles enjoyed less prestige than Canadian. However, they were less controlled than the American one. And we could argue that the different placing of the foreign experts and the struggle with the complex, well, power geometry that was established in that way was a key element in the formation of professional community, but also in formation of this globalized new workplaces and help to make sense of the unfamiliar location by forging alliances. If we look in the cooperation between the experts within the community, or within the professional community, then I would argue that the professional solidarity was stronger than the political connections, right? And it was key for survival, as in very often the Polish experts were left alone once they dispatched or they left Poland, and they get a very little support from the Polish state, and in a lot of cases, they were, especially in the first moment after they arriving, the Western colleagues who were already longer in the country had a much better cultural expertise, since the British or the French or the Dutch or in general the Western European experts were much better prepared in a cultural matter. So they were kind of they helped out the Polish experts in a lot of cases. As one of the geologists reported already in the 60s, or perhaps you mentioned that one of the reasons, or this was the societal perception in Poland, that the experts going abroad, they're going to get some financial benefits and profits. And probably in a lot of cases, this was one of the moment for a decision to agree to go abroad. However, at the end of the story, not those who are politically active or most active were dispatched abroad, but the language and the skills or qualification were key in this in this matter. And again, as one of the experts or leading geologists who were sent in the 60s to Ghana reported, he stated that he will be better experienced, better qualified by his return. However, and perhaps he will be even able to use some of his research for pursuing his career. However, he won't come back as a financial better situated person, or not even as a kind of agent of solidarity, because a lot of this dependencies at home and dependencies in the country of his project hampered the establishment of stable and productive relation. What, of course, was established, what again, the professional networks that helped out or they lasted long, and in a lot of cases helped out the experts to stay in the country, to move from the state to some private sector, or to go abroad, or to migrate to the Western Europe. What is quite interesting in the sense, or when you're talking about the negotiation of knowledge and circulation of knowledge, what I observe by the geologists is in a lot of cases, because the expertise of the Polish geologists were not as asked in Poland, they were they acted as intermediaries between the local research or the research that conducted in, let's say, Ghana and Nigeria and the Western world, however, not as the authors of the final publication, for instance, but as kind of the middle person who sent her research to some colleagues in the Western universities to be published there in a cooperation, or even sometimes under the name of the Western colleagues.
Yes, Zaur, you wanted to comment
yeah,
on that?
that was also very, very important and essential what Justyna told us. This question, the main question, maybe why? So what was the motivation also of the people? Not only, I mean, if you put it in a very simple way, we say, okay, students want to get better education, so that's why they decide to go to the Eastern Bloc, or they have sympathies towards communism, or maybe both of them. But what is with the geologists in a PRL, that they have also double or another additional motivations to go? The same was also in the Soviet Union, by the way. The work abroad, and doesn't matter in which, in what country, meant also the supplements to the salary, the monthly supplements, and that made the work abroad so attractive. And we come also to two aspects which I think are of paramount importance here. I mean, we put in a very truly way the Cold War in the title of the talks. This aspect of the Cold War sounds very fear-bringing somehow, but if we put it like in the between 40s and 90s, that would sound less menacing. And I guess the context was less contradictory, as we assume very often. It was already mentioned that Canadians worked in Baghdad in the same space as the people from the socialist countries did. And it was not the case that like Polish secret services were able to control all conversations happening in Baghdad between a Canadian or a Pole in 60s or 70s. So it was less contradictory, I guess. It was more, even if not common, but the interaction were not under the total control at that time. And the aspect with this la vie quotidienne, the everyday life, how that looked like at that time in Ghana, or for these kind of expats. That is also a very interesting aspect. I was interviewing one lady. She worked in Mazar-e Sharif as a translator because the Soviet Union built up the Polytechnical University in Afghanistan in 60s and 70s, and she was sent there as a young graduate from the Oriental Studies department at the Azerbaijani State University, Kirov University at that time, and she was in her early 20s as she went there. And I asked her, so what have you done, I don't know, at 8 o'clock or at 9 o'clock? And she said that at 8 o'clock we left the dormitory and we went to work. So she went to this university and she translated simultaneously the lectures given by a professor on engineering, whatever. So she translated that from Russian into Dari. So the working day consisted of 8-9 hours of translation, or really world literally of work. And in the evening hours, they ameliorated their language knowledges. They had to create terminology in Dari, in Pashto, in other languages related to Afghanistan now. And so like a huge work was conducted, and they were acquiring the knowledge themselves. Those who came to give knowledge were acquiring the additional knowledge in a very intensive way, and then transmitted that back into the Iranian studies, into the Oriental studies, writing all these dictionaries on, I don't know, Russian Pashto for polytechnical purposes, for military purposes, whatever. So it was a dictionary boost at that time, the booming of dictionary work in the Soviet Oriental studies, at least. The aspect of the ethnicity, I should improve myself somehow, or correct myself. I said that that didn't maybe all the time was overlapping, but as a rule, if a student from Iraq arrived in Riga, in Soviet Riga, or in Soviet Kiev, it could be the case that his ethnicity was not of the primary importance, but that played a role if he arrived in the Soviet Yerevan or in Soviet Baku. Suddenly an Iraqi appeared as a Sunni, Shia, Christian, or whoever, or belonging to a Turkic minority there. For instance, the Soviet Azeri radio's Arab services, they hired some people from Iraq at that time, from Baghdad, but all of them belong to the Turkmen minority. And so this aspect of the Turkic solidarity played a role. And the same goes also for the inter-Armenian dialogue, inter-Armenian interaction between the Middle East and the Soviet Armenia, and so on. So ethnicity played a certain role. And the third aspect, Justyna mentioned that with the testimonies, working on the interwar period, I found out that the pieces written in 50s, 60s, and 70s about the interwar period, in the necrologues, in the also in testimonies written in somehow journals which were not of scientific nature, but were built up like somebody recalls the common time of studies somewhere. They entailed information, additional information, very interesting one about the period in interwar. And the same goes but about the dimensions of spokenness and unspokenness, what people are ready to tell about their experience over there, particularly if it's about personal life, about and about sexuality. That played a crucial role in that, because it's something what remains unspoken, but what can matter. In a project related to interwar Istanbul and even to the Second World War Istanbul and 56s, we have noticed that for many European Orientalists, the same goes also for France and for Germany, for many homosexual Orientalists, the Middle East became a refugium, giving a refuge. It was an inter-man communication. And it's about the conservative approach at that time towards homosexuality in Europe. And suddenly the Middle East turns out as a more liberal refugium for that. It's very difficult to put it into the nowadays perspective, but it was the case in the 20s, 30s, and the generation of Georges de Mézil, of Helmut Ritter, and many others. It was very characteristical. The same goes, we know from some studies about the inter-Soviet academic communication in the 60s and 70s, that the aspect of sexuality played a huge role as one of the motivations why students from the Caucasus or Central Asia tried to get an invitation to join a conference in Kiev or in Moscow, so that played a role, particularly among the male students. And this aspect played also a certain role within of academic communication between the Middle East and Eastern Europe as well, what is so difficult to describe very often, because the people are not so ready to talk about that, and particularly not in person interviews, and what they rarely mention in the testimonies.
I just wanted to react to what Justyna and Zaur have said. The first point, it is the comparison between East and West, and I've made the comparison between Poland and Switzerland in the organization of welcoming of foreign students from the third world, and it's quite surprising to see that the chronology is very similar in both countries. You have quite the same programs that have been developed at the end of the 50s, at the beginning of the 60s. You have in Geneva African Institute that have been grounded, and in Warsaw in 1960 there are also an African Institute. So you can see a very similar chronology, and also on the type of control on students. You have the police who tried both in Switzerland and Poland to use the foreign student for entering in the foreign groups that were in both countries. So the relations between the police to the students are also very similar. So I think, like Zaur said, that the West and East are quite similar in this knowledge relation with the third world. And to the question of why that begins, or why did Poland send experts or accept foreign students? I think behind these questions, it's very interesting to see that there were not only academic, diplomatic activities, but we can see it also in the, I would say, mass culture in Poland. You have new magazines like Continente or in the lot of articles in the students magazine leitete about foreign students in Poland. You have in the cultural magazine Ogłosy, for example, also a lot of views, reports, images about this new position of Poland in the world, and where Poland is not only an immigration country for academic like Marie Curie, but also in an immigration countries. And it's a change that it's very important, not only on this academic field, but I think in the broader perspective in the society. And we can see, so what I've made until now, but it's I have to go further in this direction, but schematically we can see that there is in the 60s discourse in the media that is very official, and the students are considered as brothers and sisters, or as friends within the global socialism. But in the 70s and at the beginning of the 80s, there was very interesting articles about the everyday life, the experience, the sexuality of students, and this relation to these foreign students, to this alterity. I think it's very interesting to see within the political history of the PRL between the 60s and the 80s. And the last point I wanted to mention is about sexuality, and it's true that it's an unspoken thing also in the testimonies, but with oral history is I think it's possible to understand more with some archives, with for example in newspapers you can see students who want to rent a room outside of the official dormitories. It's also some very infra things to understand the problems for the students who often lived more than 1 year in Poland to live with this. But and you are right, it's unspoken in the student life, but it's very present in the media as stereotypes, above all against the students from Africa. And you can see very much such a lot of stereotypes around the sexuality of students. You can see also that in a lot of report of police that was always around dormitories of foreign students or academics, like as it's called in Poland. And the sexuality as a stereotype were very present, I think.
Yes, thank you for these comments. I think all of you touched on this very interesting topic of translation, not only linguistically, like Zaur mentioned, that there were new, even sometimes new words had to be thought of or developed to actually translate the concepts being taught, but also translation of concepts. For example, it comes to my mind from my case is the poor students of the Department of Architecture at the University of Mosul, who were taught by Wrocław staff, and on the third year they had to design a residential complex you know, of the style that were so popular in Poland at the time, with no residential complex, vertical housing present in Mosul at all. So in this ways, the mere concept of, in this case, particular forms of living had to be kind of translated, or the students themselves had to try translate it to the local context, but also the lifestyles that you mentioned, and also the knowledge that the students, for example, in Poland were gaining at Polish universities, and then what happened with that knowledge when they came back home. And from the accounts of the students, it's often very visible that this moment of going back home with this baggage is very difficult, and then to kind of trying to readjust to their home settings privately, but also in the professional life, to try to, you know, make sense of what they were taught in their home countries. So I think this touches very well on this topic. I would just like now to maybe open the floor for questions from the audience. So if any of you have a question, please feel free.
Well, if I might, I don't have a question. I just found it quite or highly interested when you both were talking about the ethnical aspects and also like the sexual orientation, how they were on one side used as criteria, on the other, as Zaur mentioned, going from the Eastern Europe, if I understood you right, to the Middle East was perceived as kind of gaining a little bit more freedom, and also creating a space for perhaps not experimenting with self-identity, but to finding or being more open about the self-identity. And what's quite interesting if we look at this, that actually it's very banal, right? That going abroad is always, or not always, but quite often a step of gaining the freedom. It was the case with the geologists going to Ghana and Nigeria. It was, if we just broaden the perspective, it was the case of, for example, African American coming to Soviet Union or to Poland in the 50s, 60s. And when I was talking about the experiences of the Polish geologists, or in general, when we are talking about the different experiences, it's very hard and it's probably not possible to find a common ground for all of the experiences, because they again are framed or differ from each other depending of political context, ethnical contexts, right, and or historical situation and so on. And when I was describing the position of the geologist, this also did not apply to everybody. Right, because for example, the experts who found an employment at universities and Nigerian universities, and especially in the 70s, there were a lot of Polish experts working in universities at the peak of the Polish employment in the 70s. At the university in Zaria in Nigeria, around 200 Polish experts were employed. And for them, going abroad meant to gain a little bit more scientific freedom. So they were offered a better equipment, for example, but also more freedom both in teaching, but also in setting up laboratories and field work. Some other example would be, for example, would be this gender-oriented physical, but also social mobility. And again, in the Nigerian case, there were cases of women dispatched to Nigeria, not to work at the universities, but for example, as school teachers, who went to Nigeria through the network from Women Network or from, for example, Women League, and perceived this going abroad in terms of feminist solidarity to foster some socialist, transnational, feminist globalization, but also again to kind of perhaps experience even to some degree with the self-identity and this female position. So perhaps the term I would use to describe all of this is borrowed from the sociologist Abdul Malik Simon, and could be perhaps summarize of this wording from below that happened by creating such spaces abroad. Okay, just wanted to comment on it. Thank you.
Yes, so again, I will thank you for that, and I will open the floor for questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, Mustafa?
Yes, if I can. Good evening for everybody. Good evening again. I would like to ask, this question would be for everybody, please, if it is possible if I would to get answer from you. We all are, including me, including me, we are focused on the knowledge circulation, knowledge flow, and so on. So I want to ask, could you tell me, please, if there were other benefits for those both countries, meaning receiver and senders, from other benefits than the educational?
I will maybe jump in now here and talk about the project I have been working on this Iranian linguist, which actually who started initially filmmaking at Łódź, but also in Sofia. So he came from Bulgaria to Poland, and he wrote several manuals of Persian language, pioneering the field in Poland. But in the same time, he also wrote 3 novels. So it was, they were literary texts. So he wrote novels in Polish language. One of them was a detective story about Second World War. Another one was a story about a bit autobiographical piece on the life of Iranian immigrants in Warsaw in 60s and 70s. And another piece was about the life of women in Iran after the Islamic Revolution of 1978, 79. So it was, you could read it as a sort of Polish, maybe Polish literature written by somebody who was not from Poland, and as I haven't told, but I'm telling now, his Polish was not as good to write a literary text in it. So the text needed to be polished very intensively. That meant that he had to interact with his students very intensively, and they worked on those texts commonly. And one of the books he wrote with one Polish writer, Marcin Reniak was his surname, and he had already experience of writing books with other people, so it was a joint venture. And so you see somehow that it was not a production of the academic knowledge, but also of literary texts, but all of them were related somehow to Iran. So he promoted the country of his origin, the culture of his origin, even critically. So he was opposing Shah regime as well as Islamic Revolution and so on. But somehow he introduced in a way he could Iran, its culture, to the Polish audience. And even this book on he has written in a co-authorship with Reniak was translated into Russian and was published by the Soviet Ministry, by the edition house of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. I guess at the year of the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, I am not sure that this book was a contribution to the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, but at least it was through the translation into Russian. You see here the certain circulation even within of the socialist bloc from Poland to the Soviet context. So I would say that the contribution was very multi-dimensional, and the benefits also of the different texts, literary texts as well as academic texts, were there.
Thank you.
Matthieu or Justyna, would you like to react to Mustafa's question?
Yes.
Yeah. So in the case of the experts, I'm sorry for jumping. So in the case of the experts, well, the educational benefits were not the primary one, right? So the dispatching of the experts from the political perspective, or let's say from the state perspective, did have clearly political economical goals. They were dispatched as promoter of experts and initially as one of the first who can conduct some surveys and being able to identify what kind of, or where and what kind of natural resources should be analyzed and exploited. So this was this political goal behind dispatching the experts. So we could say they were, right, or argue they can use as central doors opening figures for the Polish reconfiguration of the political and symbolic global self-understanding and self-positioning. From the experts, as already mentioned, their motivation was very diverse, ranging from some financial profits at the beginning and political participation of hoping for a better career, to interest in socialist mobility, or even it was sometimes perceived as a change to escape the kind of socialist daily routine at home, to some adventurous motives. So the educational were not primary. They were primary, let's say, or to some degree in the case of people who went as lecturers to universities. But here the channels of recruiting such lecturers were also different as the channels for recruiting the state experts, just to label them as then, right? Because in the case of lecturers, they were mostly recruited through some inter-university exchange or some exchange programs, cultural cooperation, or through, for example, Polish-Nigerian Association. They were established in the late 60s, 70s, both in Nigeria and Poland.
Okay, thank you.
For me, maybe it's a bit a normative question about the benefit, and it's difficult to say from here, from now, if it was a benefit or not, such exchange. But first, I would say that, for example, Language Center in Łódź made a lot of financial benefit with foreign students. And there are a lot of problems in the 80s when all the benefit of the center go to the Ministry of Higher Education, and they have lost a lot of money from the grants, and because the center had to be bigger, they have to have more space for more students, and they didn't get the money from the foreign students. So there are a lot of benefits. And I would say that generally, I think this cultural exchange, knowledge exchange, and such experience are benefit for the students and also for the society that has welcomed these students. I think when we have the real concrete interaction with people, maybe it's good against stereotypes. but you can see also, I think, such very bad experiences of student exchanges in Poland, and I would, for example, mention some films from the Łódź Film School about the places where students were living, and they are very negative and very it was very sad, and we can imagine through such films that for students it was a very bad experience, so without benefits. So that's why I think it's difficult to answer, but yes, it's very interesting question about the cultural interaction also that such contacts have made and produced.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another question from Zofia. Zofia, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Because my devices are not very good. Thanks for the interesting discussion. I have two questions which are going a bit in the direction of what you just talked about. Actually, maybe quite simple in a way, because I understand you made quite some oral history interviews, and I wonder in how far in those interviews given by former students from whatever, Arabic or from African countries, or from, mostly in how far they also mention racism or xenophobia. So what were actually the cultural encounters? And is it something which is mentioned in those interviews? This is one thing. And the other question also may be connected to this is in how far, I understand there were people who stayed in Poland, for example, this person from who wrote novels and stayed in Poland and wrote in Polish, but for those who got back, and those professors or whatever scholars who were in the other countries and got back to Poland, in how far they maintained contacts with the other countries, in how far those were really bonds which were longer lasting, or if it just they got back and this was the end.
All right, who wants to go first?
Yes. I did not yet made oral history with former students. I've used some material that have been collected by colleagues, and I've only made interview with former directors or teachers by the language center in Łódź. So I don't have such material to answer very well to your question, but I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a link to the question of benefits. What this experience make after their experience in the long time, and I have some contacts, for example, in Senegal, and they all know where were in Poland or in Soviet Union. So the people who have studied in the Eastern Bloc have such a mark, and by the friends and the family circles, we know that they were in this country. So that means that this experience is belong to the identity of these people, but I cannot answer on the oral history material.
I could try to answer based on the oral history I did. I think there are a few factors that may be relevant for those who came back to their countries of origin, let's say, or to the countries that they came from. I think one factor was the geopolitical situation. So for example, in case of Iraqis in the 1990, we have the Gulf War and then the sanctions when almost all relations were stopped, also institutional ones. Then another factor is how active were the countries like Poland or Soviet Union, how active they were in actually nurturing these relations with former students. And how, for example, you can think about student associations. There are very active students associations of former Soviet Union students in the Middle East, while you have almost no student associations of students who studied in Poland, let's say in Iraq or Lebanon or Jordan. So I think this is also comes back to what Matthieu said about this kind of scientific diplomacy that goes after like how active the countries are in keeping in touch with their former graduates who live abroad. And of course, the third factor may be the personal experiences. So simply some people had good, some people had bad, and that certainly played a role. So that would be my idea for this.
I should add here that in case of the Iranian guy I've mentioned, Kaveh Purahnama, in his autobiographical novel, he didn't touch the aspect of the xenophobia or racism. He touched many other aspects like, I don't know, weather or attitude towards religion in the communist Poland that bothered him very much. He was very secularist, very atheist even, but not this aspect. But that also partly belongs to the maybe very hardly spoken or unspoken aspects of the travel during the everyday life experience.
Maybe I would
Thank
like
you.
to answer Zofia for her questions. She asked about 2 points, yes? Yes, she asked if they keep a contact with their lands after returning to Poland. Yes, it depends to humans. Some of them they keep, and some of them they really lose the contacts with their lands. And the interesting issue or the interesting factor in this, really, some of them who finished the study after they finished the study in Poland and they went back, they returned back to their land, to their home country, they still obtained the contact with Poland. They still were keeping the contact with Poland. They were reading, they were hearing radio, and so on. So here is this, from this perspective, this thing is important. The second thing is if they had some bad experience related with the xenophobia or racism or so on. Actually, is the students of the art students in Poland, they hadn't this problem. Here, I think this depends or refers to questions of perceiving, you know. So they hadn't this problem. They were really treated as kind of elite, so high class. That's why they hadn't any experience, any such bad experience. From the perspective of my research, I could answer to those points really. Thank you.
Well, if I mean, the question is probably not really addressed in primary to my project, as I'm not looking in students and in a kind of movement in different direction, right? Not from the global south to the global north, but from the global north to the global south. However, also in the case of the experts, even though the situation been different, first of all, what we can observe is a movement between different countries of the global south, right? So like the experts moved from one project to other, and it was quite often that, let's say, they started in Ghana, went to Nigeria, ended up in Zambia, depending on what languages do they speak. In some cases, some of the experts did decide to stay in the countries, like in Zambia, for example. There's one, or I could think about one expert, or in Nigeria, Krzysztof Schuning would be one of such experts who stay in Nigeria until his death in 2020, and became one of the leading person at the university, and also kind of one of the with a very high status, cultural status among the students. The other aspect, this is something I can't find in the testimonies, but this is what I would, or what would be of high interest of mine, to look and to understand how the experts who went to the global south with, let's say, this underlying red racism, so with this kind of socialistic paradoxical project, the anti-racist project that at the end of the day position race in the core of the socialist imaginary, to what extent this experience gained abroad, how the experience again were brought home, and to what extent were they enabled to decompose this red races, or to strengthen actually this xenophobic, or let's say this idea of the Polish racial exceptionalist, right, that enable Poles to believe, or to benefit from the privilege associated with the whiteness without having this white guilt. But at that point, I unfortunately can't really answer this question, but it would be worth to look at it for sure.
I mean, I should add maybe here with regard to the Soviet experience, an additional aspect. I mean, the Soviet Union was the most heterogeneous maybe state within of the socialist bloc, a most multi-ethnic, and with this regard also multi-confessional. The citizens of the Soviet Union, of course, were Soviet citizens, but when they were sent somewhere in the global south, the way also from Tashkent and from Tbilisi to Baghdad or to where else was via Moscow as a rule, because there were no direct flights. And it was not only the case that they just bought the ticket and then went there. So there was a obligatory conversation with a KGB officer on that, and it was like the clearance and security clearance, etc. But the very interesting baghdad is the perception of them afterwards, though over there in the streets of Baghdad or of Ankara. It's a very tricky issue. We know that from the testimonies of the Soviet Azeri writers, specialists who went to Iraq or to Yemen or to Turkey. It's a tricky issue with the testimonies afterwards. You have very often two texts they have written about their trip to Turkey, for instance, during the Cold War. As a rule, they wrote a longer text in Azeri media and then a shorter version of it in Russian that was published in Moscow. The texts were very different. They touched different aspects, and it's about the cultural codes. The stuff they have promoted in the Russian text was addressed to the Russian audience or to the audience above, whatever. So it was much more ideological. It was about class struggle, about stuff like that, about the bourgeoisie decay, and so on. But the text in the local context was different. That was touching much more common aspects in culture. It was much more in the Azeri Turkish context about the inter-Turkic aspects and interactions. And many of those people who traveled during the Cold War from Baku to Ankara or to Istanbul, they gave numerous interviews in the 90s. And even in that, you have the feeling that a third text emerges on that. They haven't told about many meetings they had. They haven't told about the sentiments they had, they could have had. So it's very tricky issue how we read the texts, because the texts emerged partly. I don't talk about all of them, but partly texts which were published in the communist context system. They were somehow censored by the authors. They were prepared. They were read by the authors as if they would be the readers of it before it was published several times. And it's very funny to see how it was then depicted, because it's also about the leftist writers they met as a rule. The leftist writers in Iraq, the leftist writers in Iran, they were so fancy to meet. But afterwards in the 90s, it was clear that it was not only the case. They met also nationalist minded writers, and they read them because they could get the books in a bookstore, and no one checked what they could read over there. So it was the story was, I have the feeling, at least with this Turkish Soviet aspect, much broader. And the same goes also for the Soviet Iranian context, that you suddenly see the inter-Shia context, that people going from Baku to Tehran stayed in the same Shia mental map. The same goes also for Najaf, that if they went to Iraq, to Najaf, they haven't left the Shia geography. That matters. That matters because they stayed in the same somehow confessional defined and designed space. However, they crossed the Soviet border. So, but maybe it's a Soviet peculiarity.
Thank you, Zaur, for this. I think with this we have to close because we are approaching 2 hours, which is the set limit. But I'm very glad that we had the opportunity today to discuss these matters. And thank you, Justyna, Matthieu, and Zaur, for your insightful comments and reactions. And thank you, everyone, for being with us on this late hour, and for the questions as well. So with that, I would like to close our 21st level talk. And again, thank you, everyone. And I hope we can continue this conversation one day all together, face to face. That would be really great. So thanks again, and have a good evening.
Thank you.